The day an empath stops explaining is the day everything changes, not because they become cold, not because they stop caring, not because they suddenly lose the ability to understand people. The change happens because they finally understand something that most people spend their entire lives missing. They realize that understanding someone and convincing someone are two completely different skills. For years, the empath explains. They explain why they feel hurt. They explain why a boundary matters. They explain why respect matters. They explain why honesty matters. They explain why loyalty matters. They explain why silence after betrayal feels different than silence before it. They explain their intentions. They explain their motives. They explain their heart. And they do it because they believe that if someone truly understood, everything would be different. But then one day, after enough conversations, enough misunderstandings, enough emotional labor, enough attempts to translate their soul into language, a realization arrives. The realization is simple. People often understand far more than they admit. The problem was never a lack of explanation. The problem was a lack of willingness, and the moment that truth settles into the mind, something remarkable happens. The empath becomes quiet, not weak, not defeated. Quiet, there is a difference. Weakness speaks because it needs approval. Silent power observes because it already knows. The strongest person in the room is rarely the loudest. The strongest person is usually the one who no longer feels compelled to convince everyone else of what is already true. Think about that. How much of human exhaustion comes from trying to prove reality to people who benefit from denying it? How much energy is spent explaining obvious disrespect to people who created it? How much life is wasted presenting evidence to people who were never conducting an honest investigation? The empath eventually reaches a point where they stop submitting their experiences for public debate. They stop asking permission to trust their instincts. They stop asking permission to have boundaries. They stop asking permission to walk away. And suddenly, their presence changes because silence has a language of its own. A person who constantly explains sends a message they never intended to send. The message is this: please understand me. But a person who understands themselves sends a different message. The message is, I understand me. One seeks validation, the other possesses certainty. And certainty is powerful, not because certainty is always right, but because certainty removes desperation. Desperation leaks. People can hear it in your voice. They can see it in your eyes. They can feel it in your decisions. When you desperately need someone to understand you, your emotional state becomes dependent upon their response. Now they control the outcome. Now they control the emotional temperature of the conversation. Now they decide whether your truth gets accepted. But the day an empath stops explaining, the control disappears. Not because the world changes, because they change. They begin understanding that truth does not require unanimous agreement. A mountain remains a mountain even when someone calls it a river. Reality does not become false because someone refuses to acknowledge it. And this is where silent power begins. Silent power is not passive. Silent power is not fear. Silent power is not avoidance. Silent power is the ability to maintain internal certainty without external confirmation. That is rare, extremely rare. Most people are emotional weather vanes. Every opinion changes them. Every criticism moves them. Every rejection shakes them. Every misunderstanding wounds them. But silent power creates a different center of gravity. A person with silent power listens more than they speak. They watch patterns. They observe behavior. They measure actions instead of promises. They stop collecting words and start collecting evidence because behavior is always speaking. Always. People tell you who they are every single day, not with speeches. Not with declarations, not with social media posts, with patterns. The empath who keeps explaining often ignores patterns because they are focused on potential. They see who someone could become. They see hidden goodness. They see future possibilities. But silent power teaches a harder lesson. Potential is not reality. Intention is not action. Words are not behavior. And once that lesson is learned, emotional intelligence evolves. Real emotional intelligence is not simply understanding emotions. It is understanding the role emotions play in decision making. It is understanding when empathy serves wisdom and when empathy becomes self-sacrifice. It is understanding the difference between compassion and permission. It is understanding that caring about someone does not require carrying them. That distinction changes lives because many empaths are trapped not by other people, but by their own inability to separate understanding from responsibility. They understand someone's pain and immediately feel responsible for solving it. They understand someone's trauma and immediately excuse destructive behavior. They understand someone's struggles and immediately lower standards. Eventually, they discover something profound. You can understand someone completely and still say no. You can love someone deeply and still leave. You can forgive someone genuinely and still never return. You can wish someone well and still remove them from your life. These truths feel uncomfortable because they require maturity, they require strength, they require emotional intelligence that goes beyond kindness. And that is where silent power lives. Silent power lives in the space between reaction and response. It lives in the ability to hear manipulation without defending yourself against it. It lives in the ability to hear criticism without collapsing. It lives in the ability to hear praise without becoming addicted to it. Silent power creates freedom because once your identity no longer depends on what others think, people lose their ability to control you through approval or disapproval. Imagine what becomes possible then. Imagine walking into every conversation without needing validation. Imagine making decisions without needing consensus. Imagine protecting your peace without delivering a 30-minute explanation. Imagine recognizing disrespect the first time instead of the 15th. Imagine trusting your observations. Imagine trusting your intuition. Imagine trusting your experience. That is not arrogance. That is alignment. And aligned people move differently. They do not chase. They attract. They do not force. They influence. They do not argue endlessly. They decide. The day an empath stops explaining is not the day they stop caring. It is the day they finally start caring about themselves with the same intensity they have always offered everyone else. It is the day they stop pouring oceans into cups that were never meant to hold them. It is the day they stop translating their worth into languages spoken only by those who never intended to listen. It is the day they realize that peace is more valuable than being understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. And in that moment, something extraordinary happens. Their voice becomes quieter. Their boundaries become stronger. Their presence becomes heavier. Their confidence becomes calmer. Their energy becomes focused. Their life becomes simpler because they have discovered a secret that many people never learn. The loudest power is rarely the strongest power. The strongest power is the power that no longer needs to announce itself. And when an empath reaches that level, the world notices, not because they speak more, because they speak less, not because they demand attention, because they no longer need it, not because they control others, because they finally control themselves. That is silent power. That is emotional intelligence. And that is the day everything changes. There is a moment that almost nobody talks about, a moment between awakening and transformation, a dangerous moment, because when an empath first stops explaining, they often mistake silence for emptiness. They think they are losing themselves, when in reality they are finally meeting themselves without distraction for the first time. For years, their identity was built around emotional movement toward other people, fixing, helping, understanding, calming, rescuing, translating, absorbing. They became experts at reading rooms before entering them, experts at sensing tension hidden behind smiles, experts at detecting emotional shifts before words were even spoken. Most people never notice how exhausting that is, to constantly monitor emotional weather, to constantly predict reactions, to constantly calculate how every sentence might land, to constantly shape yourself into someone easier to receive. Empaths become masters of adaptation because adaptation kept them emotionally safe. And eventually, adaptation becomes automatic, so automatic that they lose sight of where performance ends and authenticity begins. That is why silence feels unfamiliar at first, because silence removes performance. Silence exposes truth. And truth can feel uncomfortable when you have spent years earning connection through emotional labor. The empath eventually realizes something unsettling. Some people never loved their authenticity. They loved their accommodation. They loved the endless patience. They loved the emotional availability. They loved the benefit of having someone who could understand them without requiring accountability in return. But the moment the empath becomes quieter, patterns emerge. Suddenly people complain. You've changed. You're distant. You're cold. You're harder to talk to. No, they are simply harder to control. There is a difference, and emotionally intelligent people learn to hear the difference beneath the words. Because emotional intelligence is not just reading emotions, it is reading motives beneath emotions. A person may accuse you of changing when what they truly mean is this: you no longer respond in ways that benefit me. That realization alters human interaction forever. Now, the empath begins seeing conversations differently. They begin noticing how often people ask questions not to understand, but to gain emotional leverage. They begin noticing how often apologies arrive without changed behavior. They begin noticing how often guilt is used as a tool of control. And perhaps most importantly, they begin noticing how often they abandon themselves trying to keep peace with people committed to chaos. That is one of the hardest truths to accept. Some people survive through emotional confusion. They create instability because instability gives them influence. A calm person cannot be manipulated easily. A grounded person cannot be emotionally dragged into every storm. So chaos becomes strategy. And empaths are particularly vulnerable to it because they naturally search for emotional resolution. They believe every conflict can be healed through enough honesty, patience, communication, and understanding. But silent power eventually teaches a brutal lesson. Not every conflict exists because of misunderstanding. Some conflicts exist because confusion benefits someone. That changes everything. Because now the empath stops entering every interaction with the assumption of shared good faith. They begin observing first, listening first, watching first. They stop responding to words immediately and begin studying consistency over time. And that single shift changes relationships, friendships, business interactions, and life itself. Most manipulation collapses under observation. Manipulation depends on emotional urgency. It depends on speed, rack now. Defend yourself now. Explain yourself now. Prove your loyalty now. Prove your love now. Fix this now. Silent power slows the entire process down. And slowed observation exposes truth. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable manipulative people become when you remain calm? It unsettles them because calmness interrupts emotional control. When someone expects emotional reactivity and receives composure instead, the dynamic changes immediately. Now they cannot predict you. Now they cannot steer you. Now they must confront themselves without your emotional energy, fueling the interaction. This is why silence can feel threatening to emotionally immature people. Silence removes access. Silence removes easy influence. Silence creates reflection. And many people fear reflection more than conflict. The empath who once over-explained begins discovering a new form of communication. Presence. Presence speaks before language ever does. A grounded nervous system changes conversations before words begin. People feel certainty. They feel restraint. They feel awareness, they feel observation, and most importantly, they feel the absence of desperation. Desperation is loud, it interrupts, it overshares, it overproves, it overjustifies. But silent power does none of these things. Silent power understands something critical about human behavior. People rarely value what constantly seeks approval. Think carefully about that. The more you chase understanding from people determined not to give it, the more your value appears negotiable. But the moment you stop chasing, perception changes, not because you became manipulative, because self-respect became visible. Self-respect has weight. It changes eye contact. It changes posture. It changes tone. It changes timing. A person with self-respect does not rush to fill silence. They do not panic when misunderstood. They do not collapse under disagreement. They understand something most people never master. Misunderstanding is survivable. Rejection is survivable. Disapproval is survivable. What destroys people is self-abandonment. And empaths have a habit of abandoning themselves slowly, not all at once, gradually. A little compromise here. A little silence there, a little tolerance for disrespect, a little emotional exhaustion hidden behind kindness, until eventually they wake up one day emotionally bankrupt, wondering why giving so much produced so little peace. That question becomes the doorway to transformation, because eventually the empath realizes something painful. Being needed is not the same as being valued. That sentence alone has the power to change a life. Many people stay trapped because they confuse emotional dependency with love. They become useful listeners, useful healers, useful supporters, useful emotional containers. But usefulness without reciprocity becomes exploitation over time. And silent power recognizes exploitation quickly, not with anger, not with bitterness, with clarity. Clarity is dangerous to unhealthy dynamics. The moment clarity enters confusion, manipulation weakens. The moment clarity enters emotional chaos, patterns become obvious. The moment clarity enters relationships built on imbalance, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. And that is why growth often creates loneliness before it creates peace. Because the empath begins outgrowing environments where self-sacrifice was rewarded more than authenticity. At first, this feels isolating. Conversations change, connects shift, tolerance decreases, energy becomes selective. And for someone who spent years trying to maintain connection at all costs, selectivity can feel cruel. But it is not cruel. It is intelligent. A locked door does not hate the people outside. Boundaries are not punishment. Boundaries are recognition. Recognition of value, recognition of energy, recognition of emotional consequence. Every interaction costs something: time, attention focus, peace, nervous system stability. Emotional energy. The empath eventually realizes they have been spending emotional currency without measuring the return. And once they become aware of emotional economics, their life changes permanently. Now they ask different questions. Not, can I help this person? But does this connection damage my peace? Not, how do I make them understand? But why am I trying so hard to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding me? Not, how do I save this relationship? But why am I the only one trying to save it? These questions create emotional maturity. And emotional maturity often sounds quieter than emotional immaturity. Immaturity reacts immediately. Maturity observes first. Immaturity demands emotional satisfaction. Maturity values long-term peace. Immaturity seeks victory in arguments. Maturity seeks clarity in patterns. This is why silent power becomes so transformative. It removes emotional impulsiveness. And impulsiveness is where most manipulation succeeds. People say things they do not mean because they cannot tolerate emotional discomfort for 10 seconds. They explain too much because silence feels unsafe. They overcommit because boundaries create guilt. They remain accessible because distance feels selfish, but emotionally intelligent silence changes that dynamic completely.